Good evening, everyone, and thank you for your patience. My name is Dan Chambers, the lead minister here at St. Andrews Wesley, and we're just so delighted that you can be gathered here this evening. St. Andrews Wesley United Church is honored to support First United Church, who has planned and organized and raised funds, and who has hosted tonight's Roddan Jubilee lecture with John Ralston Saul. First United Church offers amazing ministry on the downtown east side, meeting people where they are, supporting practical needs, offering physical and spiritual nourishment. And here at St. Andrews Wesley, we care about the ongoing work of reconciliation. Under the guidance, knowledgeable guidance of some of our lay leaders, we have a reconciliation action plan and are especially appreciative of the relevance of tonight's message. If you'd like to find out more about that, Kaisa and Shirley will be in the lobby after our talk tonight. If you're interested, every month, just about every month, we show a movie here at St. Andrews Wesley in the salons, just right through the hallway. This Tuesday night at 7 o'clock, by donation, we're showing Indian Horse, based on the Richard Wagamase novel. And so please come if you're interested. Tonight, after the lecture, John Ralston Saul will be available to sign books in the lobby. We don't have many books, but there are a few there for purchase. So if you would like to secure your blessing, make haste after we're finished. Feel free to be yourself here. If you need to use a washroom, there are washrooms right down the hallway, unisex and gendered washrooms, and also gendered washrooms in the back lobby. And so make yourself at home. I invite you to take a breath and allow yourself to arrive here. Know that you are welcome here in this place, no matter who you are, no matter where you are from, no matter whom you happen to love, no matter what your religious background may or may not be. This is a place of welcome for you. And as we gather here in this place, we do so aware that we gather on the traditional unceded and ancestral territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And so I'd like to invite you to help me welcome the Executive Director of First United Church, the Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne, who will introduce our speakers tonight. Carmen, please.
Thank you so much, Dan, for acknowledging the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, for the warm welcome, and for, again, making this amazing venue available to us for our lecture series, featured lecture tonight. We truly appreciate the support of St. Andrews Wesley United Church, tonight and always. Good evening, everyone. I have the privilege, as Dan just introduced, of serving as the Executive Director at First United. As the first church in Vancouver, and today as a different expression of church in the form of community ministry and outreach, we have been leading social change in Vancouver in innovative ways for over 130 years. Our vision is a neighborhood on the downtown east side where the worth of every individual is celebrated and all people thrive. And we answer the call to seek justice when we respond to individual needs on the downtown east side, advocate for social change, and provide sanctuary in the heart of the city. Our lecture series, and tonight in particular, is an embodiment of seeking justice in all three of those ways. We started the Roddan Jubilee lecture series last year with the goal of nuancing public conversations around social justice issues that matter, especially as experienced by those on the margins in our neighborhood at Hastings and Gore. We're very grateful for the support of Van City Foundation, of Dignity, and of the United Church of Canada, and of Robert Brown for their support in making this lecture series happen. In doing so, our lecture series responds to individual needs by exposing the systemic injustices and barriers that are faced by Vancouver's most marginalized, by advocating for social change through public forums and education, and providing safe spaces or sanctuary to learn together about how to seek justice and create a society where the worth of every individual is truly celebrated and all people thrive. Last year, our lectures featured New York Times best-selling author and journalist Johann Hari, who talked about addiction and stigma and why Vancouver should be proud of the downtown east side. And Sarah Shanley Hope, a leader in the climate change movement in the United States, who challenged us to think about middle-class white privilege in the quest for social justice. This year, we're thrilled to feature Indigenous justice issues as the topic for our lecture series. Both tonight and our February 9th lecture with Karen Joseph, CEO of Reconciliation Canada. Close to 40% of people in the downtown east side identify as Indigenous, according to the last census. While we're a faith-based organization that responds to individual needs primarily through shelter, food, core programming, and spiritual care that recognizes the inherent worth in all spiritual backgrounds and beliefs or no beliefs, we're not an Indigenous organization. The United Church of Canada has taken seriously its own commitment to live into its 1986 and 1998 apologies and the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to amplify Indigenous issues and seek justice where many injustices abound in Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationships. The program this evening will be the lecture by John Ralston Saul and a response and conversation with Dr. Justin Wilson, and I'll introduce Justin first. Dr. Justin Wilson is a professor of Aboriginal Studies at Langara College and is currently department chair in his department at Langara. His community work includes co-chairing the Federation of Post-Secondary Educators Decolonization, Reconciliation, and Indigenization Committee, and was part of British Columbia Open Campus project team called Pulling Together, a guide for indigenization of post-secondary institutions, of which he helped to draft their curriculum. He describes himself as an intercultural father of 3, is happily married, and also considers himself to be a 16-year-old dad. I'm sure he'll explain that later. His research interests include transformative learning, resiliency, and personal leadership, among others. I am thrilled tonight to introduce our featured lecturer, who needs no introduction, John Ralston Saul. A prolific writer and public speaker, John is one of Canada's preeminent public intellectuals, thinking, writing, and speaking in visionary ways about the challenges we face in Canadian society and what we can do to overcome those challenges. Always concerned, at the heart of his work is the public good, John turned his attention to the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians in his 2014 book, The Comeback. And we are thrilled, John, that you agreed to join us here tonight to talk about his views on what non-Indigenous Canadians need to do to seek the public good and develop new and renewing relationships with Indigenous Canadians. It may seem an odd choice to start a lecture on Indigenous issues with a non-Indigenous thinker as the featured speaker. But myself, as an Indigenous woman and a leader in the United Church, I made an intentional choice to invite John to speak because I was challenged by another preeminent North American thinker's writing, Thomas King. In his book, The Inconvenient Indian, a curious account of Native people in North America, he begins the 9th chapter with the following small excerpt. What do Indians want? Great question. The problem is, he says, it's the wrong question to ask. While there certainly are Indians in North America, the Indians of this particular question don't exist. The Indians of this question are the Indian that Canada and the United States have created for themselves. As long as the question is asked in that way, there will never be the possibility of an answer. Better to ask what the Lubicon Cree of Alberta want, or the Brantford Mohawk of Ontario, or the Zuni of New Mexico, or the Hupa of Northern California, or the Tlingit of Alaska. But I'd just as soon forget the question entirely. There's a better question to ask, he says. One that will help us to understand the nature of contemporary North American Indian history. A question that we can ask of both past and present. What do whites want? No, it's not a trick question, and I'm not being sarcastic. Native history in North America as writ has never really been about Native people. It's been about whites and their needs and desires. What Native peoples wanted has never been a vital concern, has never been a political or a social priority, end quote. Tonight's lecturer has thought deeply about why that is and why that shouldn't be. Please join me in welcoming John Ralston Saul.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Reverend Lansdowne and Reverend Chambers and Justin Wilson for being here. I'm looking forward to our conversation. You always have this moment when you stand up in a church and think my life could have been different. I could have done this every Sunday, or could I? But anyway, it's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be back in Vancouver. And I also want to say, I never do this really, but I know that this has been supported to a great extent by Van City, and I've been involved one way and another with Van City since the 90s, and it really is an organization which gives, the private sector a very good name through the cooperative movement and this idea that ethics and business can be together. And I think it's an admirable organization. I'm glad it's coming to Toronto, and I hope it goes to other places in Canada. It's very moving for me to be part of a series which is not happening in the Downton East Side, but which is coming out of it in a sense. And like a lot of people who come to Vancouver for years, I would go through it. And, people would tell me about it, and I never really took the time. And then in '99, when I got involved in sort of public affairs, as it seemed, I thought really the most important thing I could do was to try and understand poverty better and to talk about it a great deal, and about homelessness and about exclusion and so on. And so I immediately, the first trip to Vancouver, organized to spend a serious amount of time in the Downtown East Side, and every time I've come to Vancouver since then, I've done that, because it seems to me that on the one hand, it's a place, of course, of suffering and tragedy and poverty, but on the other hand, it's also a very exciting place and a remarkable place. And I remember the first time going through it with Jim Green, who's now dead, of course, and this sort of big argument, which was so important and still is, that what is the answer? And of course, the middle class and the upper middle class and the ruling class, whatever you want to call them, thought, well, the answer is move everybody out, because that's what we've always done. Just move them out, make them disappear. Can't have them at the center of the city. And the whole idea was, no, this is a community, and let's build it into a stronger and stronger community, no matter how complicated it is. And I think that task, which is a human task and a spiritual task, which leads to a physical task of well-being, is an amazing thing. Not having people there in full sight is a way of pretending that this is not happening. And that community getting stronger, I hope, in the center of Vancouver is a very important accomplishment. And the fact that it is now 40% Indigenous, says many things, but that also is important. And these things have to be taken at face value and embraced at face value. Sometimes it's very, very precise. I remember when the injection site, which the first in Canada, was opened in 2003, I think. And I was here not long afterwards and insisted on going there. You can imagine a lot of people didn't think I should. And every time I came to Vancouver, I went there. Why? Well, A, because I felt it was important to be there, and B, because by going there, you were showing that people should go there and that it was something that had to be embraced unless we could think of some other way of handling these issues. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the Downtown East Side tonight, but it's very much in my mind in everything that I say. And as it is, I know you're all Vancouverites, and I know that you're the kind of people who are interested in this subject, and therefore it must be in your minds. Let me say first that I really didn't write a word about Canada except in articles in newspapers, which of course are like blinks, and then they're in the bottom of a bird cage, until I was 50. And after all, I published my first book when I was 29. So I spent a long time not writing about Canada and writing about the world. Asia, North Africa, big philosophical treatises and so on. I took a long time, in a way because I somehow felt that although I'd been brought up in an army family and therefore moved every 3 years across Canada, and I actually knew the country reasonably well, because most people are brought up in one place and they think that's what Canada's like. They think it's flat, or it's mountains, or it's lakes, and that's what it ought to be, and then they're shocked to find later on that it isn't just that. And they either get over it or they become troublesome. I don't know. So anyway, for 50 years, I was increasingly frustrated. And I must admit to you, I've never talked this way in public, I mean, about myself. I usually don't do that. I was increasingly frustrated, and it went right back to my childhood, by how I felt we were talking about ourselves, how we wrote about ourselves. And I felt that the way we talked about ourselves was buried in a kind of self-congratulation, which, it goes on to this day when people, the best country in the world and stuff like that, which is sort of embarrassing, really. I mean, what does that mean? It's either a place that functions and does the best it can do among its citizens, or it isn't. And I felt increasingly that the basis of what we were talking about was that it was what's called the settlers, the immigrants, whatever, the refugees, that the European model was the model that had built Canada. And you were endlessly hearing, well, of course, Canada is so much more European than the United States, which of course is total garbage. The United States is profoundly European. It's the last creation of Europe. It's the Enlightenment nation state. All its documents are European Enlightenment documents. The fact that they're having a bit of trouble living with that is a separate issue, but that's because in the 19th century they took on European nationalism. So it's this struggle between 18th century French in particular, but also English Enlightenment theory and 19th century raw nationalism coming out of slavery and so on. And I mean, there's only really one, until actually the revival of populism in Central Europe in the last decade, the only surviving European country in the world was the United States, right? Whereas Canada has never been European. I mean, you wouldn't think it standing in this very beautiful church, but there's no question that those who came late in the 19th century and the early 20th century in large numbers from England and Northern Ireland in particular used the power of the British Empire to sort of impose themselves, particularly in British Columbia, particularly in Vancouver and Victoria, to impose this idea of the Britishness of the place, and to impose some of the good things, but a lot of, frankly, the worst things, including racism, into the core of the country. It was already there. It had been brought by earlier immigrants, but it became very, very serious as the 19th century wore on. And the English and Northern Irish influence, I can say that because I'm English Northern Irish, so I can say anything I want. Sort of, got worse and worse and worse, and it almost broke the country up during the First World War. It caused terrible crises, not simply vis-a-vis Indigenous people, but vis-a-vis anybody who wasn't, out of the English and Northern Irish traditions, Protestant language, interpretation of history, and so on. So I became more and more uncomfortable about this. That we were in effect lying to ourselves about who we were, how we got here, what we did over 500 years, and how we worked at first or were dependent for a very long period of time upon Indigenous people. All this was sort of swept away in favor of, English common law and French civil code and British parliamentary this and whereas if you go to the Canadian Parliament and then you go to the British Parliament, you realize, they're both parliaments, but they don't function in the same way at all. You go to the Supreme Court of Canada, you go to the Supreme Court of Britain, they don't function in the same way at all. They don't work the same way, because if we worked the way they work, we'd have had a civil war long ago. Because it doesn't function in a large, complex, non-monolithic country which has an incredible number of contradictions, which according to European theory is not possible to have in the same country. And we made it work, well, pretending on the surface this was somehow a natural outcome of Queen Victoria or something. It's totally mysterious because, of course, they did the exact opposite in Britain to what we've more or less done here. So I think we're still caught up in that colonial web. We've taken it on, Canadianized it, if you like. And so I brooded about this, I thought about it. And like most Canadians of my generation, and frankly the generations before and a lot of the generations afterwards, one of the biggest ignorances or ignorances that we had was really not understanding anything about the Indigenous reality or the Indigenous role, unless we were in government or somehow directly involved. It wasn't in our education. It had been carefully written out, except for some really, European-style heroic things and some conquering things, but it wasn't there. And you could be living in a city with a reserve in the middle of it or next to it, but you were taught as if Indigenous people didn't exist as a vibrant or important culture, let alone Indigenous people didn't exist as the foundation of everything that's here. And of course, there was a kind of ignorance about the betrayal by the immigrants, by the settlers, of all the relationships which had been established with Indigenous people from the 16th century on. And the betrayals began mainly in the second half of the 19th century and spread out over a lengthy period of time. But it wasn't simply the ignorance of what had been done wrong, which we've talked a great deal about over the last, I think as a people, we've talked more and more about it over the last decade. I mean, this is 500 years of settlers in Canada. We've talked about it over the last decade, right? That tiny amount of time. But what we still really don't talk about, and this is, you say, well, how are we to do reconciliation? The churches are working on it, lots of people are working on it, but there's also a sense of this seems to be not going the way we thought it would go, this is frustrating, or what are we supposed to do exactly, in spite of the fact there are 94 perfectly clear recommendations in the TRC, that just do that and then we'll see afterwards, right? It's a very practical road that's been laid out. George Erasmus laid it all out in the Royal Commission. I mean, it's all there, but we're confused. And I think one of the reasons that we're profoundly confused is because of our attachment to that colonial story. And then what comes out of the colonial, the way we've attached multiculturalism to the colonial story. And, and all of that has prevented us really from concentrating, apart from a few quick lines, Indigenous people have been here for thousands of years and so on, but not really addressing what that actually means philosophically, about Indigenous philosophy, historically, the dependence of immigrants to Canada on Indigenous people for hundreds of years. It's not they didn't know how to build something or didn't know how to hunt something, so they needed help for a couple of weeks. That isn't the way it worked. It was between 250 and 350 years of either dependence on Indigenous people or partnership with Indigenous people before we started betraying it, all of those relationships. And that's all very clear. I mean, I encourage you to take, if you're the kind of person that reads, long books or series of books, Hornblower or Marcel Proust or something like that, to take two rather different examples, that means you're capable of reading the full Royal Commission that George Erasmus co-chaired. It's a lot of fun because it's beautifully written and you discover the real history of the country. It's all there. It's fantastic, the research that was done for that Royal Commission. You just have to read it, and you'll be surprised by what you discover about what happened here and how fascinating it was and how astonishing it was and what the relationships were like, much of it extremely positive, and much of it done underneath spiritual philosophies, which were Indigenous philosophies. So, for myself, it wasn't until 1976, I was born in 47, that when I was the assistant to Maurice Strong, great environmentalist who was very close to Indigenous leaders, he was one of the sort of first people, if you like, in the Canadian leadership to have those kind of relationships, and he had them in many countries around the world, was the way he saw things. And I traveled with him and therefore was suddenly introduced to a world with my education, and I had a PhD, didn't include. So I blame myself. I could have been more curious. I could have made a bigger effort. But like many people in my generation, I wallowed in ignorance. And suddenly, there I was being taken by Maurice Strong, a man who finished high school and stopped. By the time he died, had, I think, 65 honorary degrees and so on. But who had understood the possibilities in the 1950s, in the early 1960s. Taken around by him, and I suddenly realized that I had to rethink completely the way I imagined life in Canada and the history of Canada. And so for 20 years, I engaged in a kind of self-education. There's nothing more interesting than self-education, and of enormous amounts of reading, contemporary and earlier. And, Tom King's a friend, and over the years became, friends with an enormous number of, if you like, Indigenous leaders and writers and thinkers all over the country, and spent a lot of time in small communities, and particularly in the Arctic, and listening an enormous amount everywhere in Canada, and learning, and not saying very much in public. Periodically, I would try to say or do something and inevitably make a fool of myself, because, of course, I really had only understood one bit, and I'd missed all the other bits. I mean, I remember when I was president of PEN Canada, the Freedom of Expression Organization, and Brian Mulroney was prime minister, and they took away the funding for Indigenous publications, as I remember it, and that was a freedom of expression issue, so we said we would back them, and a meeting was arranged with a group of Indigenous leaders who were in Toronto. And I went to a hotel, and I arrived, and I was this whippersnap, smart kid, I was in my 20s, or I guess in my early 30s, and I knew everything, right? I had a PhD, I'd been everywhere, I knew everything, I knew nothing, and a really idiot. And I remember I came into the room, and there were some elders, and there were some young women, and there were some, if you like, political men, Indigenous, and I said, look, I'm really thrilled that we're able to support you, and you just have to tell me what you want me to do, and I've got an hour because I've got a meeting after this. And as I said, I've got an hour, I saw all the faces go glacial. And there was a little silence, and then one of the women said, Mr. Saul, thank you so much. It's so kind of you. We just have to finish something with one of the elders. Would you mind waiting outside? So I went outside, and precisely 60 minutes later, the door opened. And they said, and I'd figured it out by then, right? The essential settler rudeness, this is my time schedule, this is how it's going to be. And so I got on the phone and canceled everything and came back in, and I just said, I apologize, I'm really sorry, that was really stupid. I've canceled everything, whatever you want, whatever time. And we sat down and had a great time, and I learned a lot, and and it was a tiny step in the right direction. So, and then gradually, 1997, pushed by a lot of Indigenous friends, I decided to start including Indigenous issues in what I wrote. So, I wrote over a period of 20 years, another 20 years, 4 books. I rarely do it this way. I apologize if you don't like it, but Reflections of a Siamese Twin, then A Fair Country, and then La Fontaine Baldwin, and then The Comebacks. I don't know, it's 1,000 pages or something, in an attempt to rethink how to think about what it's like to be here as a non-Indigenous person. But I was always very careful to write as a non-Indigenous person addressing non-Indigenous people. That's always been the direction of what I've done, because I have no right to do anything else. And recently I read a very interesting piece by Justin Wilson, it's going to be on stage, in which he said, quote, rather than just watch, I call on everyone to be their own witness. I think it's a wonderful line. And you were probably addressing a lot of Indigenous kids, I don't know, but I think it's an invocation to all of us that we have to take on responsibility for what we say and how we act and how we expect the authorities to act. After all, they work for us. Now, what I've just described, that taking on of responsibility and how hard I found it, because that's what I'm trying to describe to you, is how long it took me. If you're younger than me, you have less of an excuse than I do. You know, really. And the younger you are, the less of an excuse you've got, because there's more and more in the education, there's more and more being written about, there's more and more on radio and television, there are fantastic novelists, philosophers, etc. It's all there. But it is a period which I think is still incredibly difficult for Indigenous people to figure out how to do this conversation with us after we've taken so long to even enter into a contemporary conversation with them. But it's also, I think, hard for non-Indigenous people to reconsider profoundly what we have been so certain of for so long about ourselves, so certain about who we were, how we came to be here, how we acted once we got here. And it's not just the doing wrong, it's also the rewriting of history in which the heroes don't necessarily come out of England or France, you know? That actually there are other sources, there are other heroes. You know, the greatest orators on the prairies in the second half of the 19th century were almost entirely Indigenous. Big Bear was probably the greatest orator on the prairies, not some, you know, white politician, Indigenous. But of course, when he gave his closing speech at his trial after the Riel rebellions, or uprising, he asked specifically of the judge, he said, you know, will you please make sure that so there's a person there writing it all out, will you make sure that this is handed to the press and so on, so that people know what we had to say, what we First Nations had to say about this? And the judge very precisely ordered that the speech be destroyed. You know, it's very interesting. So there are little bits of it which tell us how brilliant that long intellectual speech was. From Big Bear. And funny because, of course, you know, one of the great Indigenous traditions is if you're not funny, you're dead, you know, no matter how serious the topic. So I think it's very hard for us to confront the nature of our failures and to work out what to do, even though it's all been laid out in front of us. To work out how to think, and if we can't think about it, we really can't act. And when I say to think about it, I don't mean in a romantic or a simplistic way. It isn't surprising that we're struggling with reconciliation. We shouldn't be, but it isn't surprising. Forgive me for the contradiction. We're having difficulty catching up in spite of the amount of warning that we've been given. And, you know, in many ways, what was called the modern Indian rights movement, as it was described by Indigenous people, was born around 1900 when the population was at its very lowest and when people in government in Ottawa and the provinces thought, well, you know, just a few residential schools and it'll all be done, right? That was really, I'm simplifying, but that was really the kind of feeling. And, but from about 1900 on, the Indigenous desire for justice restructured itself to try and deal with us in a way which perhaps we could understand. You know, they were being very kind, making this enormous effort to restructure themselves, to make their arguments in a way that people like us could follow the complex and interesting ethical and historical messages that they were putting forward. And we didn't listen. We went out of our way not to listen. We passed, you know, laws. We amended the Indian Act in 1927 to try and stop the Indian rights movement, and to slow it down, and, you know, to stop them from hiring lawyers, from seeing lawyers, from traveling, from going to religious ceremonies and so on. But again, today, since the mid-90s, since the Erasmus Commission, all of this has been public knowledge. all of it, in every detail. So we don't have any excuse if we've been sending emails and tweeting as opposed to reading the Royal Commission, you know? Because that's where it is. That was where it was all laid out in this massive re-examination of the sources of what happened in the northern half of North America over a very long period of time. There's an introduction that was written. It's not formally part of the Erasmus Commission, but it was written by, I think, George himself, perhaps with others. And I've often quoted it, but I think it's worth quoting it at every occasion. And it goes like this, quote, "Canada is a test case for a grand notion." First time I read that, I thought, well, there's a typo, you know, nation, right? No, notion. The notion that dissimilar people can share lands, resources, power, and dreams while respecting their differences. The story of Canada is the story of many such people trying and failing and trying again to live together in peace and harmony. Pretty beautiful, you know? That's literature as well, you know, like all great philosophical ideas. That's literature. That trying that he's talking about is not simply emotion, although emotion is important. And it's not about being endlessly sorry. We have apologized several times, but we have apologized formally. Having apologized, the next step is to get on with it. Not to continue feeling badly about things and dreadful and sorry and, you know, and concentrating on things that are going wrong in Indigenous communities as a way of feeling bad and feeling sorry, because in the end what that turns into is what I've said repeatedly, into a new form of modern racism, which is that if you continue focusing on tragedy, which is real, the tragedy is real, but if you continue focusing on that as if that is the main way of telling the story, then what you're actually doing through your guilt, a church is a good place to talk about this, what you're really doing is pigeonholing the people you say you're feeling sorry for, pigeonholing them into being victims. As opposed to saying, okay, we've done all of this wrong and we're continuing to do this wrong. How do we change this? Tell us what to do. How do we work with you? How much money is it going to be? How do we reorganize things? You know, that's what you're supposed to be doing, not going on and on, feeling badly. So let me go back to the way we opened tonight when the minister did the land acknowledgement, which is now done pretty well everywhere in Canada at public meetings. And so that means you've heard it in Vancouver many, many times if you go to public meetings. And yes, it is a formality, and some of you may even think, while you're feeling good about it, you're also thinking, oh, I've heard this before. But of course, you're in a church, and you might have noted that in churches, things are repeated rather often. You know, at every service, they're repeated. There are certain formalities which must be said, because if they're not said, you're not in a Christian church, right? And that's true of any religious place. It's also true of any political place. You can't speak in the House of Commons unless the mace is in place. So there has to be a procession every day, and the mace is put in. And then the person who carries the mace goes and sits at the back of the room, and then certain things are said, and certain apparently unnecessary from a practical point of view or a utilitarian point of view, things are said every single day. Because, of course, the core of civilization is formalities and protocols and repetitions, because those are the structures, not simply of politeness, they are the protocols of civilization. They're the protocols of human relationships. And that repetition is an essential part of civilization. Without the repetition, you're in a dictatorship, and in a violent dictatorship which thinks it can do anything it wants, because there are no protocols, there are no formalities, there are no repetitions, there are no reminders of obligations and of empathy and of spirituality and of obligations to each other and so on. So the protocols mean a great deal. I don't think I've said this in Vancouver, so I get great pleasure whenever I hear it, because if you were serious Westerners, if you really believed in the Western myth, if you really believed in common law and civil code, you would have got up and rushed out in disgust. Because Western law tells us that if we own a piece of property, it's mine and it's not yours. You've got houses, you've got businesses, that's what law says. It's mine, it's not yours. You know, this brutal, unintellectual, unhuman, not non-human, uncivilized Western idea of ownership. Black and white, you know? And instead, you sat there and listened repeatedly to people talking about a much more complicated idea of the relationship between human beings and land. You've bought into, and I think you should, a concept that even though the land was taken in the way we know it was, nevertheless, you're accepting that this land has other meanings. It has other purposes. It has other obligations. And you have other obligations and responsibility vis-a-vis this land, as you're reminded at the opening of every single public ceremony. So you have to go from the formality of it being said to actually trying to understand what the purpose of that is. What is the message lying behind the land acknowledgements? That attempt, I think, a very important attempt to push us into thinking differently about our relationship to place. Doesn't mean you're going to be expelled from your house. Indigenous leaders aren't saying they're going to expel you from your house. That's not what they're saying. But what they're saying is, you know, we have to stop with this brutal, simplistic English-French view of how property functions, how human beings dominate property and hand it around to each other, even if it ends up with the world cooking itself to death, you know? So because you ask, well, what is the logic of the Western methodology? The logic is very simple. The logic is, today in Canada, a handful of premiers and the leader of the opposition are willing to oppose serious actions on global warming in order for there to be a few more jobs today, even if it means that their grandchildren are going to fry. Right? So this is when I talk about brutal, when I talk about uncivilized attitudes towards place and land, that's what I'm talking about. That's what comes out of that. Does that mean that Indigenous people are against development? That isn't what that means. What it means is that these formal openings are a possible introduction for us into an interesting way of thinking about where we are and what our obligations are. A sophisticated way of thinking, a very modern way of thinking. And what lies behind a lot of that, as I read Indigenous philosophy over the years, one of the greatest philosophers in Canada, Richard Atleo, who's a Hausit, and has written 2 brilliant books called Tsawak with different subtitles, talks a lot about this, is this concept that human beings are not the Platonist, you know, we're the kings and everything comes underneath us, you know, the animals and everything comes underneath, and then we organize the humans. So which humans are on top? And then there are lesser humans, and then there's sort of animals, and then there's place. And then we get to order it all around. And instead of that, behind these protocols lies philosophies which could be called Tsawak, or the Cree would call it probably Wetaskiwin, which are concepts that we are part of the whole, that we have a relationship with place, and that relationship means that we don't get to do anything we want. It doesn't mean we're going to be poorer. It doesn't mean we're going to suffer. It doesn't mean we're going to do badly. It means we're going to have a much more sophisticated and complex and civilized relationship with place. And interesting enough, as the power of Indigenous people is returning in Canada, it couldn't be happening at a better time in terms of rethinking our relationship to philosophy and our relationship to power and our and to what we think about human beings and their role on Earth. So, you see, if you just take one piece, you think, how do we do reconciliation? You just take one piece, like those, the land acknowledgement. And I could speak for 2 or 3 hours on the land acknowledgement to say, and what I'm trying to demonstrate to you is, it really is about rethinking the way we think about our relationship with Indigenous peoples, but actually how we rethink our relationship with this place and with each other. And it opens the possibility of a very different kind of conversation, which probably wouldn't go over very well at a Republican Party convention or whatever, but it would be a very different kind of conversation. And I think then it opens you up to, curiously enough, to something that seems like the exact opposite, which is say, well, truth and reconciliation. But you see, if you just stop with reconciliation, then there's this danger you slip off into, emotion, guilt, I want to do something, whatever. Whereas the truth is that you can't have reconciliation if you don't have restitution. There is no such thing as reconciliation without restitution if the history that led up to reconciliation is the history that we know, in terms of land, in terms of residential schools, in terms of poverty, in terms of lack of services, of unfunding education, heating, housing, schooling, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, reconciliation has as an essential part of it restitution. But again, that isn't about, Vancouver, suddenly everybody has to leave Vancouver. It's not what it's about. But it is about the action side of reconciliation. That we have to stop negotiations, and they have slowed down to some extent. Negotiations between governments and Indigenous people and private sector is usually involved on the sidelines, where the governments are battling to save our money by giving less, hear the words, giving less, right, as opposed to returning. Whereas we should be thinking, if somebody is negotiating, I'm going to now make one of my jokes, so you could laugh appropriately, that if somebody's asking for 1,000 square kilometers and $2 billion, our negotiators should be going in and saying, that's absolutely unacceptable. We'll give you 1,500, and we'll give you an extra billion. What are we negotiating about? What is it precisely? To give less money? No, I'm not saying that Indigenous people think or need to think of themselves as Canadian citizens. That's a whole other discussion I'm not having here tonight, which is the nation-to-nation discussion. But who is it we're saving the money for? We're talking about people who are legally Canadian citizens. Why would we be trying to give them less? What is the advantage to Indigenous people being poorer? Tell me what the advantage is to the Canadian public that Indigenous people should get less. I'd like to know. I've never heard an acceptable argument. The richer Indigenous people are, the more powerful Indigenous people are, the better off we're all going to be. If you think about reconciliation that way, I think you'll find it quite relaxing. Because you'll suddenly realize that it is about power. It is about well-being. It's not about charity. It's about equilibrium and inclusion from the point of view of well-being. We have to stop trying to, in all negotiations, it's still going on, trying to reduce the status of Indigenous people to the status of municipalities. This has been the federal government position. We actually must do away with their fundamental rights. Why? What is the actual purpose? The Pays des Braves in Quebec, which is a major treaty with the Cree, wasn't done out of the goodness of heart of the government of Quebec, but they were smart enough to do it, where they just said, no, okay, we have to do a deal because otherwise we're going to lose the pulp and paper industry in Quebec, so we're not going to even talk about trying to remove your fundamental rights, the rights which predate the arrival of the settlers. We'll just leave it in there. We'll just put it in there. Why not? Have you noticed the revolution? Have you noticed the Civil War? Have you noticed the people of Quebec are poor? No, it was a brilliant treaty. It was one of the most, that and the Nunavut Treaty are probably the two most important agreements in the last half century in Canada, because they just let go and agreed that they would not try to remove these rights. And there is no necessity to do it except a leftover of the old British colonial tradition. I was just with a young Métis scholar, Joshua Nichols, who's at the University of Alberta, who with someone else whose name I don't have with me, has written a very important paper on the legal, how do we do nation to nation, basically. And one of the things he says is, just get rid of this whole idea of reducing Indigenous peoples to municipal status. Nation to nation in a way sort of could mean, for example, provincial status. Provincial status in the sense that provinces have rights which are not given to them by the federal government. The rights which provinces have are their rights. They can't be taken away. That's a very fundamental thing which no European understands about Canada. They just assume that it's all been given by Paris or Berlin or something and can be taken back. So we have to rethink how we think about autonomy, how we think about the words nation to nation. So, as I pointed out, there are 94 recommendations in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But the key, all those things can be done. It'll take a bit of time, but they can be done. But the key to it, I believe very strongly, is culture. Look at what was done in the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. Look at what was done to Indigenous people. It was all about the removal of culture. Culture in terms of spirituality, in terms of clothing, in terms of song, in terms of declarations, in terms of the expression of ideas. This idea that culture is something to entertain middle-class people when they're tired in the evening, if that was all it was, why did the government of Canada, the government of British Columbia, and the corporations cooperate in doing everything they could to strip out languages, spiritual events, the cultural well-being, and the cultural beliefs and activities of Indigenous people? Why was the Indian Act amended? In order to attack precisely the culture, in 1927, the culture of Indigenous people, in the broadest sense of that word, including the spiritual sense. It was all about destroying the protocols, destroying the structures, destroying the way in which people organize themselves culturally and relate to each other culturally, destroying the languages, destroying all of that in order to undermine the possibility of formal public actions. So it's clear that it's happening, but it's happening painfully slowly, that the continuing underfunding of education for Indigenous kids it's not even a question of Indigenous rights, it's a question of human rights. That this is being dealt with at such a slow and painful way, partly because of the kinds of laws and so on that we have. The language issue, in the year 2000, there was literally no money and no interest in any government in Canada for supporting Indigenous languages. Apparently, there's a law that's either already in before Parliament or is going to be before Parliament, which will change all of that. We'll put some real money on the table. But the point is that this is one of the most urgent issues in the country, because there are close to 60 Indigenous languages of this place. I won't say Canadian languages, of this place, of the northern half of North America. They come from here, as opposed to English and French. We adopted and adapted English and French. These languages are from here. They are an expression of here, and as they disappear, we lose access to the meaning of this place. It isn't about whether you speak that language, whether you speak Haida. It's that people do speak Haida, and therefore have an understanding of that, of Haida Gwaii, which has a meaning so deep and profound, going back thousands of years, that we can't think about Haida Gwaii in the same way without that language, without the doors that opens into the profound unconscious of all peoples. And as a former head of PEN, I have to say that the removal of people's languages is one of the most fundamental ways that you do away with freedom of expression. That's the first big step. And the British did it in Scotland and Wales, and the French did it all around France, and the whole building of Italy was about removing all the regional languages. This is standard European-style way to put together a nation-state, remove all competing cultures. So we have a very short time frame in which to not interfere, but to ensure that if money and structures can be helpful from the side of the governments of Canada and the provinces, that we move as fast as possible on the front of Indigenous languages. I could say exactly the same thing about healthcare. You know, we have these fabulous medical schools and hospitals running across the southern border of Canada. There's virtually nothing north of Edmonton. And none of them, except for a little bit of stuff done at the University of Northern British Columbia and what's done in the new medical school between the Lakehead and Sudbury, none of them are teaching the necessity of understanding how to provide health care to isolated small communities. I know 50% of the Indigenous community lives in cities, but 50% doesn't. And the entire attitude towards heating, clean water, health, education, all of it is designed for people who live in Vancouver or Calgary or Toronto. And that's a different way. You can't live in a community of 200 or 500, 1,500 or 1,000 in the Arctic or in northern British Columbia using the theories of UBC. You can't do it. It can't be done because those theories are designed for cities. They're not designed for isolated small communities. And this is an urgent area where, you know, in order to play our role, we have to ensure, why aren't there more universities in the north? Why are we still fighting over the fact that there isn't really a university in the Arctic in Canada, the only circumpolar country in the world without a university in the Arctic? This is incredibly urgent. And, you know, when the businesses, the mining companies come into towns and, you know, or come into areas and they, you know, they're negotiating and they're saying, well, now we are going to train people. And I've asked them, I've been in conversations, say, okay, so we're training these kids to drive tractors and, you know, things with big shovels on them. I say, well, wait a minute, there are 2,500 Indigenous lawyers in Canada. Have you hired any lawyers? You know, the Indigenous business community is one of the fastest growing business communities in Canada. Have you hired any managers, Indigenous managers? Oh, well, you know, change the subject. You know, so there's an urgent need to think about how those relationships are done in the North. That's starting to happen. Smart companies understand this. Even if they're being cynical about it, they still understand it to some extent, but it's happening painfully slowly. So let me just finish by going back for a moment to what would make reconciliation natural. It is a well-informed memory of what has happened here over the last 500 years and what happened before we arrived. But over the last 500 years, a well-informed memory of the good and the bad. And I think in particular, and I've been saying this now for years, we have to really digest the incredible influence of Indigenous people on the immigrants, settlers, on their ideas of how they could survive, how they could belong, how they would relate to each other, how you live in a complex society, which is not a European style society. We have to get rid of that European whitewash. We will not be able to reconcile until we come to terms with the incredible influence of Indigenous people on what is best about what we call Canada. And you know, the example I always give is very simple. The immigration and citizenship system in Canada, which is flawed, but it is pretty good by international standards. It's had its low racist moments, but there's been a line You could say there's been a line from 1867 or from 1847, but there has been a line really for 500 years because the fundamentals of the Canadian immigration citizenship policy are Indigenous. They come entirely, the roots are entirely Indigenous philosophy of belonging and welcoming. They have entirely to do with the concepts of circles and the welcoming of people into communities, as opposed to European ideas of metaphysical change. You know, you're here now, you have to metaphysically change into something else. They have, the whole approach that we have towards immigration and citizenship comes out of 300 years of the experience of settlers coming and being welcomed by Indigenous peoples before we betrayed that relationship. And that is deep within us at our best, as opposed to at our worst. We have to come to terms with that. It's funny because I say this endlessly, and I say it in front of ministers and deputy ministers. Nobody ever gets up and shouts at me. I think at first they were so surprised to hear it, they didn't know what to say, but now they've heard it. And they can't think of anything else to say because there is nothing in the European tradition which would possibly be able to explain the way in which we do immigration and citizenship. 86% of immigrants to Canada become citizens within 5 years. In Europe, it's about 10%. And in the United States, it's about 40%. It's a different philosophy, and the roots of that philosophy are Indigenous. And if you can just accept, if you can walk out this door agreeing with me on that, you are one big step closer to reconciliation because you will understand that your relationship to Indigenous peoples is not what you thought it was, that your debt to them is gigantic because you're settlers, and you wouldn't be here as citizens if they hadn't provided this example of a non-European, non-Western, non-Enlightenment approach towards welcoming and including people. And finally, I would just say, this sounds a little simplistic and it is not romantic. It's very important to remember, every society has strengths and weaknesses. And I'm sure any Indigenous people in this audience will give a list of strengths and weaknesses in their society. But I have never seen, in reading everything I've read on Indigenous history, that racism was never a part of the way in which they did things. There are other things that one could disagree with that might be problematic. But racism was not a characteristic of Indigenous philosophy or society. Racism was brought to Canada and North America and elsewhere from Europe, and in particular from England. That the racism at its worst in Canada and the United States is an English form of racism. The French were actually much better. Hard to say it in Vancouver. But it was the English racism where they were measuring drops of blood and, you know, turning Darwin into a sort of an argument in favor of racial superiority and so on, which caused so much of our problems. So I think we have to be conscious of things like that. We have to say, oh, that's interesting. You can actually have a complicated society with a lot of problems that doesn't include racism. It has other problems, but not racism. How do we get out of that? Pretty difficult, considering how much we've done of it. But there is an enormous strength in us because of those 300 years and because of the increasing strength and power of Indigenous people today. There is a possibility that we can protect ourselves from the rising racism in the world today. If we are conscious that we have roots, that we can ask, that we can get advice, that we can talk to leaders about, which will help us avoid falling into these age-old Western traps. So I'm talking about reconciliation is about non-Indigenous people to a great extent, discovering a memory which you already have, but have spent the last 150 years in denial of. A memory of not being dependent on European or US ideas, but actually being in large part a product of Indigenous ideas and approaches. And I think if we think about that, it will be far easier for us to bring back ethics to the core of our own actions. And I think one of the reasons, if I may say, that the churches have become more and more positive and interesting in all of this is because once the churches lost political power, you know, which happened in the 20th century. Well, when would you say it started happening? I mean, it started happening in the middle of the 20th century, I suppose. They were able to go back to the core of their work, which was ethical work. And ever since they got rid of the power and went back to ethics, they've become great allies in the kind of work that I'm describing. And so I think that is a compliment in a kind of backhanded way. You know? So, there are, and as a final comment I would just say, of course today there are people who say, but look at all the differences among Indigenous people. They disagree about pipelines, they disagree about this, they disagree about that. And to which I would reply, what an incredible sign of the vibrancy and the revival of Indigenous power and influence. Of course, any sophisticated and complicated society is filled with disagreement and contradictions. Only people in total despair are forced to agree about everything, you know? Or because they're in the hands of some maniacal dictator populist dictator who tries to make them agree about everything. If, for the sake of the nation, we must all be in agreement. But the disagreement that you're hearing in Indigenous communities is a sign of the health and strength of Indigenous peoples and of their cultures. What better time to be reconciling? It is harder to reconcile with complexity, but then non-Indigenous people are also pretty complicated, it seems. I mean, there are some slight differences across the country, for example. But on the other hand, I have to say that complexity is a lot more fun than simplicity. And disagreement forces you to be more intelligent and to think about yourself in a more intelligent way. And the consequences of that complexity are that it becomes easier and easier for us to understand each other. So, you know, understanding the other. Indigenous people understanding settlers, settlers understanding Indigenous people. I'm grossly simplifying. What I would simply finish by saying is this. Indigenous people have spent an awful long time understanding us. They understand us. It's not a particularly pretty picture, and they have been very generous and patient with us. We, on the other hand, have not done our work. We are still way behind in our reading, in our understanding of history, and our understanding of ourselves as it relates to Indigenous people. We have an enormous amount of work to do, but it can be done very fast, very, very fast, if you set your minds to it. It isn't about romanticism. It isn't about guilt. It's about getting a handle on what this is about, who Indigenous people are, what are their ideas, what do they represent, what is the history of us with them, not just the bad, but also the good, and digesting that. And the more you do that, as you start doing that, you'll find that the complexities of reconciliation suddenly become a great pleasure and not as hard as all that. Thank you very much.
As I was sitting here looking at all of you, I couldn't help but be grateful. Here you are on a Thursday night, giving up your precious time with your loved ones, and you're here, and we're learning how to row together in unison. And I was struck. This is my first time here.
It's quite something, eh?
What a magnificent place of worship. And I was struck by the choir. You got a beautiful stage here, and I kept hearing, the more diverse the choir, the richer the tone. And what we're learning to do is we're learning how to work in harmony.
Right.
So yeah. Can I say a couple of things and I'll explain to you what it means, and then we can begin. I'm going to speak in a Haystuk language on my mother's side, and it's important you all know that this is something that I didn't grow up with. Our languages were devastated by residential schools. So I'm learning how to think Haystuk. And I want to honor the ancestors that are part of this place. And that's how I've been taught. You mentioned those protocols. So I'm going to introduce myself in Haystuk to the ancestors here. Yo, himasas, umaks, duguklot, gayasika, kasoach theas eki squalas, nachamach squalo anosiam. Gayasika Musqueam, Slewatooth, Du Skopmash. Justin Hisklanugwa, Hastoch Dogowinugwa, Hastoch Canadian Nugwa. Egi Nakwala Nugwas Dugwainam, Managawala Wiwokilaxam. What I shared in the language was simply introducing myself and where I come from. As, you know, on my mother's side, she comes from Bella Bella in the Central Coast. And she left home. I've got quite an intercultural past. So on my father's side, I'm a descendant of one of the people that worked on the atomic bomb. I don't know the whole story on my grandmother's side, but we may be related to one of the lineages of one of the popes, and the family had to flee. So I call myself an intercultural hot mess sometimes. So the reason I bring that up is because, you know, Chimamanda Ngozi had this beautiful video where she talked about the danger of a single story. And as you were mentioning about the importance of being one, that's what I was saying to you. We're all one here, right? We may be different colors, different shapes and sizes, but to me it's no longer about race. It's about learning how to be human. So the concept of, you know, as the, you know, Huamok people, the Stalmok people talk about, it's being human. So what does it mean to be human? I'm fascinated by the topic of race because race is often used to elevate and deprivilege, often at great peril. And the work that you do is really, really good, authentic space, and it's an invitation. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you to my cousin here, who, where I come from a matrilineal society, and we kind of get voluntold to do stuff. But I know that Carmen she does an amazing amount of work, and it's nice to be here tonight. So I'm all ears.
Well, you know, it's interesting, this sort of idea of the complexity, because of course it's, you know, the whole system of the British system was, you know, well, if you've got this amount, then you're 1/4 this or 1/4 that, and the dividing up was a way of giving or taking away power, or money, or both, and you know, in a way, the people who did the worst out of it were the Métis people, because they were, you know, caught in the middle and purposely sort of squeezed by the people who defined being a human by how many drops of blood they theoretically said you had of this versus that. It's such an, you know, I mean, you know, what I always find about racism so fascinating is that, yes, of course, it's absolutely terrible, but of course, it's really, really funny, right? I mean, what could be funnier? It's like some sort of dark comedy, you know, trying to identify people by sort of ideas of how much blood they've got from this. And, oh, there's your Irish grandmother coming out, you know, but except it's made into public policy as opposed to something that's said after a long lunch around the table. It's actually a policy which allows people to do things against people. And that still is there, you know, that we haven't completely gotten rid of that.
Yeah, it's pretty profound. I can't help but think of, you know, J.K. Rowling's and Harry Potter, and, you know, who's a pureblood and who's a mudblood and who's a muggle, and apparently there's another classification in there somewhere. But, you know, the whole concept of rank and status is something that even I, up until the last couple of years, have really didn't realize that I needed to decolonize myself and my own thought process, my own mind, my body, my spirit. And Shane Point is one of the local people from Huamuk who said to me in a very loving and stern way, I made the mistake of commiserating with him once about some similar topics.
Right.
And he just listened. And Shane's got these big bushy eyebrows, so he's looking at me and then he says, by the way, I apologize, this thing is weird. I'm not used to this. He says to me in a really loving way, he goes, "Are you done?" And I kind of went, oh, here it comes, right? And he simply looked at me and he said, in a very loving and gentle way, he goes, "Are you Homo or are you Indian?" The term Indian is a construct that was made by the 1867 BNA Act. So when I introduce myself as a Haystock Canadian, I'm very proud of that. And I think we're getting to this point where more and more of all of you are beginning to understand, we don't know what we don't know. We didn't learn about this in schools. Everything of Indian reality was considered a mystery, and it was relegated to the Indian agents and this mysterious ministry that they called, well, I still know it as, Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, but over the years, they have gone through so many name changes, you can't keep up. So it was deliberately designed to relegate this mystery surrounding the whole concept of people. And there are over 600 different Indigenous groups in Canada, and it's complicated. The one thing I think is really great is to recognize their ingenuity and their intercultural communication, because long before internet, 911, cell phones, they had the ability to circumnavigate trade routes very effectively. They had to learn how to communicate diplomatically if they wanted to make it back home. And that's something that I'm really learning to reintroduce. So status and rank are really, really difficult conversations to navigate, especially when we talk about truth and reconciliation.
Yeah, I mean, there's always status because, when we're talking about protocols and things, there are elders, there are, hereditary chiefs, there are, so there are all these things, but they're not actually a phenomenon of race. They're something completely different. They're just part of the structures of the organization of society, and there are many, many models, and some of them work better than others, and it depends on the times as well. But you're looking at your notes. You took some notes.
Well, we like our titles in society, don't we? Where I come from in a matrilineal society is when our aunties ask for our help, we need to be there to support them. I'm very mindful of, Cindy Gladue today. I'm very mindful of all of the murdered and missing women and girls out there that are struggling. The reason I bring this up is because one of the things that I am learning to do now is I'm introducing myself as someone who has a tremendous amount of male privilege. And I also introduce myself as a recovering patriarch. You had mentioned a lot of these things being brought here, but where I came from, we needed to use our strength and our gifts as human beings to support one another. So if you were a leader, you were someone who served the people. As a matter of fact, you can imagine the people when they first came here and they're looking around and they're like, wow, there's a lot of nice trees here. Take me to your leader, let's negotiate.
Yeah.
And we looked at each other and we said, which one? So we'd bring them to the women. And no, take me to your chief. Take me to the men. And what's interesting is that, you earned respect. And it was as a responsibility. So when I look at this beautiful, beautiful structure here, I feel very humble. It's been taken well care of by all of you as the members of the congregation. For some reason, you feel very special and attached to this place. And how it was expressed to me by one of the Skolmash elders was, in a conversation to one of the presidents of one of the big logging companies. It was Chief Bill Williams, I believe, who said, you know, when are you going to start acting like you're going to live here for a really long time? So I have to be honest, this summer I was in mourning because I couldn't even see across, I live in Deep Cove, I couldn't even see. You know, our world is burning up. And I've never seen that. The last 3 days I've been really enjoying how beautiful it is because it reminds me of my responsibility. So, and to maintain that. But that wasn't an easy road to navigate.
No.
You know.
And, you know, and that's, I mean, I think that's part, what you're describing is that business of, you know, how do we see the land? I mean, so much of Canada was built on the idea that, you know, the money was in the cities, and there was all this richness in 3/4 of the country that was, it might be fish, it might be mines of various sorts, it might be logs, and the idea was to get that money out of those things and bring that money to the cities. And of course, it's a terrible cliche, but of course, that's why it's always so funny in a very bad way when people say, well, do we really have the money, you know, for Indigenous people? I say, but when you took all the money to the South, what are you saying, you can't return it? You know, because it's there, that's where it came from. A very large part of the GDP, which is a crazy way of counting, I mean, comes out of the north of Canada, 3/4 of the country. But it isn't seen that way because of the way in which the cities and the southern universities define what matters. And they don't define small communities or people living in the north or Indigenous people as being what matters. They define the cities and then getting the stuff, you know, out, not putting something back in. Anyway, you had more notes.
You know, I'm thinking about wealth. And I'm thinking about what that means. When I was younger and I, you know, was going through university and made my way through the academy, I went in for the wrong reasons because I was going in for rank and status. And I know you're the philosopher here, so you please be patient with me. The word sophistication comes to mind, and I think of its etymology, if I remember correctly, is one who practices the art of sophistry, which is literally defined as someone who uses their language to manipulate and deceive others. When I think of wealth, I think of holistic wealth. I think of spiritual wealth. I think of emotional wealth. I think of physical well-being. And we operate in a system of dehumanization, a capitalistic system, this massive machine that I am a Star Trek type of fan. I call it the Borg. Or, you know, if any of you have seen the movie The Matrix, you know, when Neo wakes up in that pod, you know, in that sea of all of those different. So one of the things I'm very mindful of is John Trudell, the late activist of the American Indian movement, who said, you know, I'm just a simple man trying to make it in a world that's increasingly losing, you know, its understanding of being human. And one of the things I'm very grateful for of many of the, you know, the Huamuk and the Stalmuk peoples is I was reborn here, you know, at a period of really, really tremendous growth, a period of transformation for me. And it was those ancestors that supported me. Sa'ast Squalaman. Which is why I'm here tonight, is to share my wealth with all of you. And really, really encourage you to keep focusing on being human, learning to become better relatives. One of the things that I'm passionate about is the intercultural communication, which we shouldn't minimize any one part of ourselves. I'm a capitalist as well, you know. I have to reconcile with myself, and I believe Karen Joseph is coming. You know, Bobby Joe said, and I'll never forget it, he said, we're all Indigenous from somewhere, and we're all reconciling with something. So we shouldn't feel guilty about our privileges, but we should feel guilty about not doing something about them. And I think it's my obligation to pass on the wealth to all of you. And thank you for sharing your time. It's not just about the money, although that helps, right?
Yeah, it helps. Although it's very interesting when you kind of look at people who volunteer. I mean, you must have seen this. I mean, very often the people who do the most volunteering and are people who don't really have very much money. I mean, you know, I've seen. I mean, I've even seen statistics on it. So you know, I mean, many of us here have done reasonably well in our lives, and maybe we volunteer a lot. But it is astonishing when you actually look at the numbers and you look at who spends their time doing stuff for nothing. It's very, very often people who simply don't have very much, you know, but they have a kind of clarity about their role in society, which I think is very moving and very telling about how democracy can work and how societies can work and how relationships between people, you know, can work. In my sort of study, or whatever you want to call it, in Toronto, which is a strange sort of 1890s built house. It's up on the top floor, and it has you know, those Edwardian houses have little towers often coming up them, right? So it's got this little tower with 5 or 6 windows on each floor, and I'm on the top floor in this study, been in Haida Gwaii quite a bit, and there was a wonderful line from the Haida, which I can't say in Haida, which is, the world is as sharp as a knife. Do you know this? The world is as sharp as a knife. If you don't watch out, you'll fall right off. It's a fabulous line. I mean, really, about how to be a human and how to have relationships and your obligations and your self-control. Anyway, it so moved me and marked me that I rang up some people I knew, because I knew Guja, I know Guja a bit, and said, could I possibly put it around this, you know, little tourette in my office in Haida? And so one of the hereditary chiefs said, through other people, said, you can use it, but we'll send you a recording of exactly how you should say it if you want to say it, and exactly how you should write it if you want to write it. You know, so I was given precise instructions. So I have this every day. I go up there and I write lying down. I always have. It's very odd, but it's just, I hate chairs. Stools are worse, but anyway. I lie down on a sofa and I look up, and there's this wonderful reminder of how delicate human relationships are and how delicate our relationships are to the place. And it's Haida. And I love that. I mean, it's just
I could sit and listen to you guys for hours. I could sit and listen to you guys
So can
for
I, before
hours.
you do this,
Yeah,
can
yeah.
I just ask a question? You're in a college. How do you think it's going with the kids vis-a-vis Indigenous languages?
Well, language, there needs to be more support for languages. David Newhouse, someone that I think of very fondly, talked about the importance of this new relationship that we're all moving towards, and recommended that when we look at Indigenous languages, we need to consider them all a pillar of this society. They've been here a very long time. And just like the choir, I think when we can really go out of our way to support Indigenous languages and recognize, I'll never forget, it was at Musqueam. We did a special reconciliation ceremony there, and one of the students shared their own story, and she said something very simple. She goes, in her mind, reconciliation means being able to introduce yourself in the language on whose unceded and occupied territories that you're on. Start there. Although I will say this, in addition to, I see a lot of young people in my job. I'm very grateful for what I do. People from all over the world. I was saying to you earlier that our domestic enrollment is actually increasing while domestic enrollments are going down. And it's because of Langara's approach to truth and reconciliation. The reason I bring this up is because we need to go back to the Chiach. We got to go back to the Gwe'ilas, the laws, which means understanding place, understanding what that means. As an example, at Lord Stanley's Park, just around the corner here, there's this beautiful, beautiful place that Sokwale Siem mourned her husband. And those of you who know the story, she mourned her, she loved her husband so much. He was such a good man. He was kind, he was gentle, he was brave, he was loving. And when he passed to the spirit world, she mourned him for a very long time. And every morning she got up and she sang. This is the place that is referred to today as Siwash Rock. Now, those of you who understand Francais know what that actually means, Savage. So going back to place is a real way of getting people to connect with their culture. You had mentioned it earlier, and I wrote it down. I was so moved by it. You said it's about culture, not race. And when we can look to see it as your choir, you could see it as we can problem solve more collectively with our diversity than we can with our division. The young people need guidance. They need to wayfind in a way that resonates with what's in their DNA. And language is a really important part of that.
And I would just add one thing. The one thing that I've noticed, is gradually there are more and more Indigenous language courses. Of course, there are in communities as the money is gradually appearing and stuff, but not nearly enough yet. But it's also in some of the public school systems. I don't know in BC what's being done about Indigenous languages. I was just reading about Haida Gwaii, and I think they've built Haida into the high schools now, I believe. In what form, I'm not sure of it. But I know that when you talk to teachers and some of the kids where they're actually offering Cree or they're offering Ojibwe, what's so interesting about it is if these languages, if the people, the Indigenous people are willing to have them in the public school system, that means anybody can take them. And of course, the reality of kids is, they're pretty groupie, right? So if the captain of the football team is Indigenous, his girlfriend's going to be taking Ojibwe with him, right? And if the captain of the football team is Ojibwe, probably a bunch of his friends who aren't from the football team are going to be taking it with him. So, I think what you're starting to see is it's tiny for the moment, is what's necessary, which is a certain amount of non-Indigenous people saying these languages are fantastic and they're essential, and I want to be able to talk to people in them. And I think if that really happens, it'll be amazing. And just my last comment, my grandson, he just went into high school this year in downtown Toronto, Riverdale, it's called, yeah, I think. So this is right in the center of Toronto. And he said, well, I have to take this, and this, but there are two courses I can choose. And I said, well, what's the choice? And he went through the choice, and one of the choices was Ojibwe, center of Toronto. So, it's happening, but it's not nearly fast enough. This has to go into fifth gear in the next year or two, or else we're going to start losing more and more languages. And that's going to be, do you really want to go down in history as the country which oversaw the disappearance of 50 languages? Because that's what you're going to be known for, and I'm going to be known for. That we would not put the support into it, and we lost 50 of the great languages because we wouldn't move fast enough. That would be a terrible tragedy. I don't want to be known that way.
And that makes two of us.
Well, Scott, both of you, I'm going to cut you off because I'm realizing there are these magical cushions at St. Andrews Wesley, which Gary aptly described last night as having the power to turn a 30-minute seat into a 2-hour seat. And not everybody in this room has had one. And I'm also really grateful for the time that both of you have extended to us. I learned a tremendous amount. I'm extremely inspired, and I think you've given us a lot to think about. So, Walaskaya Sacha, John, and Walaskaya Sacha, Justin.
Osium.
Thank you.
That's great. I'm so glad you came.